5 days after Port Republic, 14th, 150 years ago yesterday. And he said, as the campaign was over, quote, "The privates of the whole Army have the most unbounded confidence in Jackson." Well, that sounds pretty positive. But you go back and reread it and parse it, does he mean that the rest of us don't? The privates of the whole Army have the most unbounded confidence in Jackson. I don't know. We never will know, but that's part of the story. The Jackson legend that had been crafted during these 33 days, May the 8th to June the 9th, inclusive of those 2 outer days, makes 33. In that relatively short time, there was just a whole new legend about Jackson. The newspapers had been poking scornful fun at him and for his eccentricities, but he had now become the great dread of the Yankees. Yet another court-martial. An acquaintance of mine from California, when he retired, he sold his expensive house near San Francisco and moved to Woodbridge and rode the train to the National Archives every day for 5 years and indexed the 88,000 court-martials of Northern soldiers from 1861 to 65, 88,000 of them, and found a lot of interesting ones. I cited to you before Quartermaster Sims and his difficulty. Here is a case involving a citizen in Atchison, Kansas, which seems to me to be a just delicious, delightful, backhanded compliment to Jackson. A citizen named A.R. Earl, who was a bookseller and ran a dry goods store in Atchison, Kansas. And in late 1864, this citizen bookseller was brought before a federal military tribunal. What right did they have to try him? None at all, of course. There was no martial law. The Constitution did not get a lot of attention during the American Civil War, especially in the North, somewhat in the South as well. But they dragged Citizen Earl up in front of the military tribunal to try him for treason. It was the most brazen thing imaginable. He had offered for sale a biography of Stonewall Jackson. And the citizens of Atchison, Kansas deserve to be protected against that sort of persiflage, obviously. Now, what makes this really ironic, and we know exactly what the book was because the court-martial testimony survives, is the book that he was offering for sale was a biography of Jackson written by John Easton Cook of Jeb Stuart's staff, a literary figure both before and after the war. He saw the main chance when the great hero died on the 10th of May of 1863. He scurried and put together a big biography. It runs beyond 300 pages. This is no tract. And it was published on July the 8th, a couple of days short of 2 months after Jackson's death. It was on sale in Richmond. Well, someone quickly got one to the North where it was pirated in New York by one of the larger publishers in the country at the time, Richardson. And Richardson published it without any royalties going to Cook, of course, a different country at this point. And they sold it, and it was copyright under the laws of the District Court of Eastern New York for the United States. This book was copyright in New York. It was copyright by the United States government, and yet the folks in Atchison, Kansas were worried enough about letting people read about Stonewall Jackson and corrupting their morals that Earl was convicted and sent to jail. I don't know how long he was there, probably till the war ended. The court-martial didn't follow him that far, but that seems to me to be just a wonderful example of the impact of Thomas Jackson, even in far distant latitudes, or longitudes, I guess, in that case. When Jackson died in May, countless thousands of Southerners mourned his loss, but the religious element, very strong in the South then, could not, of course, really rue his loss because God had to be behind it. And as a Southern cleric said the next Sunday, that it was good that Jackson was dead because, obviously, God now has charged himself, I'm quoting the preacher, has charged himself rather than Jackson with the care and protection of his struggling republic. Well, that didn't work out so well, that theorem, as you well know. One of the refrains about the loss of Jackson, religious refrains, actually echoes his own view. Jackson was a predestinarian, deeply pious fellow. And when his baby girl was born, who he wouldn't see until she was about 5 months old, and then only briefly, he wrote a couple of times back home to his wife in North Carolina, who was living with her parents while Jackson was away fighting the war. He said, "You must not love the baby too much. If you love the baby too much, God will take her from us if we idolize her." More than one person said exactly the same thing about Jackson's death. This is from a North Carolinian captain. "The Army loved Jackson almost to idolatry. I believe he was taken away to learn us not to depend upon the arm of flesh." a similarly pious Virginian in Jackson's own old brigade, he reached the blissful conclusion it has to be for the best. But he couldn't help admitting in a less relentlessly pietistic moment at the end of the letter, I almost feel like we were without a general now. And he was closer with part 2 than with part 1. The emergence of Fool Tom Jackson, as he was called at the VMI, because he was a horrible teacher, just horrible professor. He put the needle in the groove and it ran along, and if someone asked him a question, he just went back and put the needle back in the groove and went on. And he was teaching what today would be physics, believe it or not, natural philosophy they called it then, and optics. This is not the sort of thing where you want to be wooden, but they called him Fool Tom Jackson, the cadets did, irreverently. And the eccentricities that he had, any number of them, some of them involving his religious piety, but more of them involving personal matters and health and holding an arm in the air because he thought it was bigger than the other and he wanted it to drain and so on. People made more of that than it warranted, although admittedly it warranted some. And he was derided. The Southern newspapers in Richmond couldn't imagine why somebody who was as eccentric as that was in charge of the crucial valley. They wrote about how he was nutty, how he was eccentric, and most of them had the good grace in the aftermath to poke fun at themselves with retrospection. Here is the Richmond Daily Whig who had been saying that Jackson had to be nuts. It put a lengthy faux wanted circular on the front page. Strayed, a liberal reward will be given for the apprehension of a reformed lunatic named Old Stonewall, who escaped from the asylum in Stanton early in the spring of the present year. He endeavors to avoid detection by calling himself T.J. Jackson and fancies he's an officer in the Army. When last heard from, he was offering personal indignity to an aged and feeble ex-senator of the United States, talking about Banks and Shields. He's reported to have misdirected an imbecile cobbler from Massachusetts. In his early days, Nathaniel Banks worked in a shoe store, etc. The entire efforts of the United and Confederate governments have failed to arrest him by order of the superintendent of the lunatic asylum at Stanton. So the quite lunatic General Tom Jackson, Tom Fool Jackson of the VMI, a period of 33 days had become mighty Stonewall, and he remained renowned evermore, although at that point he had only 11 months to live. We have a few moments left in the agenda during which to take complaints and criticisms and questions and comments and whatever else you wish. Colonel Hoffman tells me if you want to talk, you probably need to go to that microphone because someone somewhere is recording this and is going to put it on a web somewhere. A group this large, some of you must wonder something about Thomas Jackson. I wonder about him right much myself from time to time.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi. I'm wondering, well, two questions here. One, I'm wondering if part of the reason pre-Valley campaign, his subordinates and everybody else had a poor opinion of Jackson was that he wasn't so much from anything that would be called the gentleman of Virginia. He was a lot more the ordinary, what we call yeomanry white.
Yeah.
And the other question is, of course, Jackson, I'm not gainsaying Jackson's great accomplishments in the Valley, but you do have to think that perhaps if he had been up against a better set of generals than, what was it, Fremont, McDowell, and Banks, it might not have worked out.
Shields, Tyler?
Shields, yeah.
Well, yeah, two parts to that. Number one was Jackson's lineage, something of a disadvantage in a very hierarchical South. I am inclined to think that it didn't matter much in a negative way. There were any number of officers who were tremendously successful who came from those origins in the South, in the North, during the Civil War, but it would have helped him had it been the other way. R.E. Lee looked like a general. Thomas F. Drayton, who people mistook for R.E. Lee, he looked very much like him. He had a big edge. He was utterly useless, but he had a good edge for starters, did Thomas F. And William Nelson Pendleton, the chief of artillery. People came up and asked him for his autograph thinking he was Lee, and he was an egregious failure as the chief of artillery. So there's something to be said for appearances. People who look like generals and people who don't. I don't think it was a serious problem. The business about was Jackson fortunate in his opponents. That's a very popular refrain. What if Jackson had faced the really good officers from later in the war? And it's legitimate, and I don't mean to deprecate it, but I would turn it around on you. What if those better generals had faced Jackson in the beginning of the war? U.S. Grant, of course, got to be one of the worst presidents in history until a while ago. By winning the war, what would have happened to U.S. Grant if he had shown up in Virginia in 1862 when Lee had all of his resources and he had Jackson? Grant could not have sublimely ignored what the enemy intended to do, which was one of his redeeming characteristics at the end of the war. If he had come into the vicinity of Richmond and left both of his flanks dangling like he did in the Wilderness, you never would have heard of U.S. Grant, I don't suppose. Who knows? My colleague Gary Gallagher at the University of Virginia, who's kind of a Jubal Early enthusiast and has either been writing a biography of Early for 40 years or pretending that he was, it's still not out. Gallagher draws this parallel to the 64 Valley Campaign, in which Jubal Early faced off Phil Sheridan and so on, and beat him repeatedly, although Sheridan had more cavalry in the 64 Valley Campaign than Early had troops of all arms. What does that do for your tactical planning? And there was a good bit more fighting in the 64 Valley Campaign. There were 3 battles in the 64 Valley Campaign that involved more troops and yielded more casualties than all of the 62 Valley. So what does that mean? I don't know, but that's what we parse at together. Yes, sir.
Understand that an earlier battle basically kept Jackson from ever again, if you will, campaigning by committee. So he kept a lot of his plans pretty strictly to himself.
Sure did.
Also, I understand that there were very few maps of the Shenandoah Valley area that were available, both to the north or the south, though Jackson had his own map maker.
Yeah.
So how does these play into his campaign and the lack of success of the Union?
Jackson had made a brief and feeble effort to be collegial. You talk about the conference of war that disabused him of talking with others. He held a conference of war in Winchester on March the 11th to decide whether the army should advance or retreat, should they fall back, and they wound up falling back. And he said bitterly, subsequently, within hearing of one of his staff, "I'll never hold a council of war again." The amazing thing here is that he even did it once, because his personal style was just so rabidly devoted to secrecy. Jackson had almost no sense of humor, but he used to say and chuckle a little bit at the wry comment by Frederick the Great, who said once, "If my coat knew my plans, I would burn it." Well, Jackson retailed that old saying again and again, and it suits his view. One of the maxims for which he is quoted, which may be too glib to be entirely accurate, is always mislead, mystify, and confuse the enemy. He was very, very, very much determined to be secretive, and that one attempt on the eve of what turned into the Battle of Kernstown is what probably put him off it forever. The part about the maps, not so much. For you folks who could go to Google Earth and find out whether the door's open in the Reverend Rood's house on Meems Hill right now, if you had your computer here, it's hard for you to imagine what it would be like to launch and execute a military campaign or a vacation with your wife and kids down the Shenandoah Valley with the mapping that was available. But by the standards of the mid-19th century, they knew what was what. And as you said, he had his own highly skilled mapper, a young fellow from upstate New York who in the 1840s took a hiking trip through the Shenandoah Valley, fell in love with it, moved to it, opened a private school, Jedediah Hotchkiss, who was never an officer. They called him Major Hotchkiss, but he was a hired civilian map maker all through the war. And Jackson recognized not only the shortage of maps, but his own tactical inability. Jackson did not have what they used to call in the middle of the 19th century, what was considered essential for a military man. The French have a word for it that I can't pronounce even close. It's spelled coup d'oeil and pronounced something like coup d'e. You all can say that. I said this once at Amphibious Warfare School, and General Van Riper was there. And he said, "I'm a German too, Krick, and the German word is Fingerspitzengefühl." I don't have any trouble with that, but they used coup d'e at the time. The notion you could look at a setting, you could look at a landscape, you could look at a theater and understand what your options were and go to explore. Jackson was not good at grasping that. So he immediately got a good map maker And 3 days after the Battle of Kernstown, he called this youngster into his tent, and he said, I want you to make me a map of the valley from Harper's Ferry to Lexington, showing all of the strong points in between. They were at the Narrows at that point. Some of you know where the Narrows is there in the Shenandoah Valley. And Jackson was pretty pleased because he had the Massanutten looming large and the big river right there, and the valley was very narrow. And Hotchkiss immediately said, well, the first thing you need to know is that the Yankees can move down North Mountain and outflank this beautiful position. So he paid off instantly. Neither side had as good maps as you would have.